The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
We hear a lot of screaming these days about how far behind the rest of the world Canada is when it comes to inoculating our population with a new COVID vaccine. However, Canada does have orders in for more vaccine than needed to inoculate the entire country several times over. The Prime Minister has said we'll share with the world if we have surplus. Could it, should it, lead to an era of vaccine diplomacy? We'll examine that tonight. Then, with violence ongoing after elections last month in Uganda, we'll consider that country's efforts at democracy in the half-century since the infamous Idi Amin took power in a coup. It's Wednesday, February 17th, and that's tonight on The Agenda. For middle powers such as Canada, diplomacy is an essential part of the foreign policy toolkit. And that's certainly been true as the federal government has worked to try to keep COVID vaccine shipments flowing out of the European Union. So once Canadians have sufficient supply, should Ottawa leverage what's expected to be a robust surplus to advance other non-pandemic related international objectives? With us to consider that in Waterloo, Ontario, Besma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and a Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And in Woodbridge, Ontario, Erica Di Ruggiero, Associate Professor of Global Health and Director of the Centre for Global Health at the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School of Public Health. And it's good to have you two back with us here on TVO tonight. Let's just start, if we can, Besma, with the basics. What is vaccine diplomacy?
Well, vaccine diplomacy is, as it sounds, really, it's countries using vaccine supply either as manufacturers or perhaps even as donors to give to countries that they want to influence, countries that they want to have better relations with. And it's really seen as a soft power tool that countries can use to open new markets, perhaps, or just reinforce good relations.
So, Erica, the suggestion here seems to be that you would share vaccine for more than just altruistic reasons. There's a bit of an underlying foreign policy motive here. Fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. I think vaccines are not just a health issue, but they're an equity issue, a global solidarity issue, but they're a political and economic one. And these are some of the issues that we need to debate when we think about diplomacy.
And following up, Erica, I presume that the people in Ottawa are debating significantly right now whether Canada wants to adopt this, and if so, how deeply they want to adopt this. What's your view on that?
Well, I would argue they've already adopted it, and they're actually exercising what I would consider vaccine diplomacy. They were actually an early and vocal champion of vaccine diplomacy. They were one of the first to contribute to something called Kovacs. And Kovacs is actually a partnership between governments and manufacturers of vaccines. And the aim was to actually support the development and manufacturing of those vaccines for all countries. It has a number of benefits, including the ability to exchange and transfer vaccine doses that can be put to better use elsewhere. And this is particularly important as COVID-19 variants are emerging. So I would argue that Ottawa has already been practicing vaccine diplomacy.
Besma, what's your view as to whether or not we're already neck deep in it?
I think we are. There's been some stumbles along the way, which I'm sure we'll talk about in terms of the optics of how we've done it. But, I think all countries that have capacity, either as producers or as, just developed countries that have the financial means, are engaging in this in their own way. The big players, of course, I would say are China and India. They're the ones really sort of getting a lot of global attention for their their vaccine diplomacy. And certainly, in some cases, they're competing against each other for the same countries to really kind of gain influence in them. So it's a very, very interesting international relations issue as well as obviously a global health one.
Well, follow up, if you would, Besma. Which countries or regions of the world do you think we are particularly trying to influence with our vaccine diplomacy?
Well, I think quite simply, you have to look at where our foreign aid has gone before. It really is a great predictor of where we want to influence. Now, I do have to point out that most of our kind of contribution is through this Kovacs mechanism, as my colleague noted, because I think this is where we think we're going to do most good. So we've really done our job in sort of putting it through the international organizations like the WHO and the Kovacs mechanism, which is really the right way to do it. But, I think you just have to follow where the money is. Where are we sort of contributing our foreign aid dollars? It's in, many developing countries. Of course, Latin America is an important market for us, economically. So we're going to, donate there, and certainly parts of East Asia and Africa as well.
Erica, you mentioned the word equity earlier, and I want to follow up on that. Do you believe that Canada either can or should use vaccine diplomacy to, for example, promote gender equity in some countries that don't follow it as closely as perhaps we'd like them to?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And as I think many people know, the Prime Minister actually made this a key part of his political platform back in 2015 as part of the feminist agenda. But I would argue that gender is much broader than just vaccine diplomacy. But the implications for vaccines to women are really particular. For example, women here at home and globally are more vulnerable in health terms during periods of crisis. And this is particularly true during COVID-19. One of the reasons is that women make up more than 70% of the health workforce and therefore are at greater risk. The second reason is the kind of roles that women play. They often are essential workers, they are PSWs. And as we heard back in March last year, if we can dial the clock back that far, female-dominated service sector jobs were among the first to be affected in the first wave of the pandemic, because many of these jobs were precarious because they're part-time, they lack benefits such as paid sick leave, which is a hotly debated issue right now in Ontario, and job security. So, of course, access to vaccines for women is a particularly important issue here at home, but also globally.
Besma, can I hear you on that too?
Yeah, of course, I completely agree. And I think the other aspect of this is that, of course, women's organizations are really grassroots organizations. And what they can do is obviously raise public awareness. I think we have to point out there's still a lot of vaccine skepticism. I mean, it's not just a developing country problem. And I just heard a poll, a YouGov poll that noted that, in France, 48% of people are still very skeptical about even taking the vaccine. So we do need to raise public awareness, public education, and women's organizations, being grassroots organizations, knowing their communities, knowing their families are really important. They help in countering disinformation. So the more we can get these types of grassroots organizations through a bottom-up effort, the better we'll be in terms of getting that kind of vaccine distribution that's needed to really stamp out this virus.
Erica, can I pursue this just one more time? And that is, I want to make sure I got a better understanding of this. I don't think there's anybody in Canada who would say, for example, men ought to get a shot before women, and who cares about equity? Men are more important to society, and therefore ... No one would take that view in Canada. But there may be places in this world where that is the view. And do you think the government of Canada ought to use vaccine diplomacy to try to stamp that out?
Yeah, I think we have to be really careful that we don't preach to the developing world what may be also issues here at home. And as my colleague expressed, while we wouldn't necessarily suggest that, we've also already seen attempts by men to jump the queue and get vaccines in northern part of Canada, as one example. And so I think that the issue is here at home as well. I guess the other issue has to do with trust in institutions, as my colleague alluded to. And so I think it's really important to build capacity for adoption of vaccines, because we can't rest on our laurels. Vaccine hesitancy is here, and part of the reason is trust in institutions who tend to deliver them.
Well, Besma, admittedly, I'm doing a little bit of spitballing here, so help me out if I'm really off base here. But for example, could Canada use vaccine diplomacy if it wanted to mediate in a long-standing dispute, for example, in the Middle East? I'm not sure how, but do you see a role for it in that circumstance?
Well, you have to be really careful with that, frankly. I mean, you don't want to weaponize the vaccine, so to speak. You don't want to make it a overly political tool, even though I think, frankly, it is in many ways. I don't think really, and I don't see a Canadian example really effectively to be used in the Middle East, for example, but, think about countries like Nepal or Sri Lanka, where you have China and India very much competing for influence in those two countries. They're doing exactly that. And frankly, the leaders of both Sri Lanka and Nepal are smart enough to actually use China and India against each other to get more and more vaccines. So, there is an opportunity, I think, for countries who are in that sort of geostrategic location and have these, potential superpowers who want their interest. There's absolutely an opportunity to use that against them.
Well, okay, let me try a more realistic example then with you, and that is Joe Biden's administration is just in. Right? They've been in for less than a month. Can you imagine a scenario whereby they're trying to get Middle East peace talks back on the rails, where they might, for example, quietly say to the Palestinian delegation, look, if you bend a little bit on this, we'll make sure that your people get X number of vaccinations, et cetera. Does that happen?
It sure could. I mean, I think lots of things happen behind the doors. Let's not sugarcoat this. I'm sure there is that kind of intervention. I think in the Palestinian territories, absolutely. This is a real, I think, it's gotten a lot of coverage, which is, Israel is obviously put on a pedestal for having such great distribution of the vaccine, but the Palestinian territories have almost gotten nothing. And in fact, there's even reports suggesting that the Israelis have blocked certain vaccines from coming in, specifically the Russian one. So yeah, absolutely, it can be done. And I think that there's even possibility that the Biden administration is using backroom diplomacy to do this. But unfortunately, I think the real overall argument on that, we're diverting a little bit of the subject, is that I don't think the Biden administration really cares too much about the Israel-Palestine conflict. They really want to move on and talk about a whole bunch of other things.
Well, as we will do right now as well, lest we get hijacked into another discussion at this time. Let's come home. We want to play a little clip here. This is Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the Federal New Democrats, on the issue of Kovacs, which we've talked about here, this international agreement on how and where to share the vaccine stockpile. And Mr. Singh's view that the federal government's approach to this may not be as tickety-boo as he'd like. Sheldon, the clip, if you would.
Canada is the only country in the G7 that is going to access Kovacs, which is vaccine supply meant for developing countries. How did the Liberal government let things get so bad?
Our government will never apologize for doing everything in our power to get Canadians vaccinated as quickly as possible. Kovacs has always been part of Canada's procurement strategy, and the Kovacs mechanism is working precisely as designed. We've been clear from the start. No one will be safe until everyone is. We're focused on getting Canadians vaccinated while making sure the rest of the world is vaccinated too.
Erica, first, can you weigh in on this and how you think we've handled the whole Kovacs foofara?
Well, I think it took a lot of people by surprise that they decided to dip into the stockpile. But technically, they could access it. Membership has its advantages. But I think this recent move was actually political, but it was seen by the global community as really a blow to efforts to promote vaccine equity. The recent statement that was made by the WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros, just reinforced the importance of vaccine equity. And I think we have to go back to what COVAX was intended to do. I mean, it was intended to establish access to vaccines for essential health workers in poorest countries, and also up to approximately 20% of the general population for each country. However, 20% is a bit of a low bar and a low ambition, and so it's not going to get us very far. And I think it speaks to a bit of shortism that tends to plague these kinds of agreements. But we really need to do a better job at ensuring that the 92 low and middle income countries who are eligible to be supported by COVAX do get their access. And if we see, economic and power plays like the one we've just seen, low and middle income countries run the risk of being left behind in accessing COVID vaccines. I would argue that we're only as strong as our weakest link, so we have to do better.
Now, having said that, Besma, I believe the finance minister was being accurate in her comments when she said, as one of the participating founding members of COVAX, we're allowed to dip into that for our own personal needs. Now, Canada took it on the chin around the world a bit for her saying that out loud, but it's true, isn't it?
It is true. Absolutely. That is our right. But I think, this is really almost an ethical question and an optics question, right? We've already seen suggestions that we have purchased 3 to 4 times our population. So the optics of this looks like we're hoarding. Right. And there's this limited supply. There's limited production of these really sought after vaccines. So it's a bit kind of awkward for Canada, which really sort of tries to sort of portray this very progressive international role. Of course, yes, we have a right to use it. And countries like New Zealand and Singapore, which are also developed countries, are using it as well. And they're dipping into Kovacs. But the optics here is the real issue. And even though we have the right, I think that, it just it looked a little awkward for us, again, because we stand on this so-called pedestal. And at the same time, we've already purchased or already ordered, 3 to 4 times of our own population.
Can you tell whether or not this has damaged our standing in the international order?
Well, I think, it depends on how many people are, know the news, so to speak, and following Canadian politics. I don't think so. But I think certainly in the halls of international organizations like the WHO, Gavi, which sort of runs Kovacs, I'm sure it doesn't look good. And I'm sure that there is some, rumblings of, hey, this is not right. This is not Canadian-esque in many ways in terms of our image as well.
There is, Erica, kind of an irony here in as much as the Trudeau government's kind of taking it on the chin at home for bending over backwards too far to ensure that others got supply at the risk of people here at home not getting theirs. And yet the fact is they've stepped into Kovacs and taken what legitimately they're entitled to take, which may make them look rough on the world stage, but may ingratiate them to the folks here at home. There's a bit of you can't win in this situation, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. They're caught between a rock and a hard place, but I think that's the challenge really that governments are faced with. But as my colleague said, Canada actually has secured the highest number of doses per capita than any other country. They still continue with the rhetoric to be publicly committed to Kovacs. But the reality is that there are many countries that still have not administered a single dose. And we can't actually wait until all Canadians are vaccinated without continually progressively giving access to our reserves of vaccine. We need to really share our vaccine allocation. This may be a short-term gain politically inside the country, but we may suffer for it long-term gain because the pandemic is here to stay for a little while longer.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. Let me read this to see if this suggests an over-reliance on globalization for Canada at the moment. Sheldon, can we get this graphic up here, please? Canada was criticized at the end of last year for buying up 5 times the supply it needs to cover its population, but it seems it wasn't positioned for priority delivery. That's partly because the country decided to invest in vaccines from European factories, afraid that the U.S., under Donald Trump, would issue export bans. It turned out to be a bad bet. European factories are struggling with supply, and recently it has been the EU, not the U.S., that has been threatening export bans, so reported the BBC earlier this month. Besma, we are apparently the only G7 country that does not have at-home manufacturing capabilities for these vaccines. Do you have any insight into why and I gather it was not for lack of trying by members of the federal government, but they apparently were unable to convince any big pharma companies to establish any domestic manufacturing here in Canada. What's the story there?
Yeah, I'm not sure that latter part's very accurate, but I do think it's going to be the headline that comes out of this is really our overdependence on other countries. We saw this in the race for masks, right? For PPE. I think we should have been very much aware a year ago that we will be needing, vaccine supply. And of course, we wouldn't know that, for example, it would come from this really sophisticated and new technology, mRNA, which I think is a real kind of specialized way of producing vaccines that we don't necessarily have. But the UK, for example, in 10 months retrofitted their own production facilities to produce those vaccines. So I just don't think that it's, accurate to say we couldn't do it. I think we are going to have really important conversations in this country about sort of unfettered globalization and our view that, we should be dependent on other countries. We don't depend on other countries for the most important things that are geostrategic and of national security. And I think we need to have an honest conversation. We did so with drugs, which we've done before in the past, and we need to do the same thing, I think, for vaccines in the future.
Yeah, Erica, can I get you on that? How bizarre is it that Canada can't we're the only G7 country that can't at home manufacture vaccines that we need to protect our population.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't surprised on the one hand, but I would say that my colleague has mentioned the example from the UK. We can actually learn some really important lessons about how they did this in the context of COVID. But I guess there are new opportunities, as we build back better from this pandemic. And that is, for example, we have a new leader of the World Trade Organization, the first ever woman from Nigeria. And so Canada, in addition to building its at-home capacity, could also influence trade rules and bring in considerations of health, labor, gender, and environment. And so it could be an influencer in that respect as well.
All right. In which case, in our last few minutes here, let's just see if we can figure out what the key considerations are as we try to balance all of the different things that we've talked about so far. Erica, what do you think are the key things that need to be taken into account?
Well, I mean, I think as we've already discussed, countries like Canada have to really balance their global commitments with their domestic interest. On the one hand, the Canadian government's it's in their best interest to take care of its own citizens. And I would argue that if there was one key thing is that when we continue to do our vaccine rollout, we need to be thinking about the most vulnerable. We've already seen some starts in vaccinating seniors in long-term care facilities, but also essential workers and racialized communities need to be taking priority. So to me, that would be one key thing that we have to bear in mind.
And Besma, how do we sort of find that very tricky balancing point between vaccine nationalism? We do want to be kind of at the forefront in the world of having our people inoculated and even maybe manufacturing it here at home, a balance between vaccine nationalism and vaccine diplomacy?
It's a great question. It's so many ways a very ethical one, right? I mean, I think as a taxpayer, I want every Canadian vaccinated before I give a single dose to any other third world country. But at the same time, from a rational, ethical perspective, why should a healthy Canadian 20-year-old get vaccinated before an elderly person in a developing country or a frontline care worker? I mean, that's the kind of, ethical debate that we'll be sort of pondering. I think it really is going to be an important issue. There's going to be lots of very interesting conversations coming from this, including the power of big pharma, IP rights. There's going to be, I think, a push eventually. I know India and South Africa are doing this, for example, to WTO about, allowing generics to produce this vaccine. I mean, there's going to be a host of really important questions. And as Erica pointed, in the Build Back Better mantra, I think we're going to have a conversation about the rules of trade in the global system.
Erica, Besma has just asked a great question. Why should a 20-year-old Canadian whose chances of really suffering adverse health effects from this thing are very low on the hierarchy, why should they get the shot ahead of somebody in a developing country who's dealing with sick people all day long, who might be a healthcare worker and really desperately needs it in order to promote health in that country halfway around the world? Who gets to make that call in Canada? That's a hard one.
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I don't know if we have enough time to answer that, but I would say it is, and just to restate what my colleague said, this is an ethical issue that has to be debated at global forum through bilateral and multilateral agreements. Again, we know how this pandemic started. And we've been hearing that we are entering an age of pandemics. So we need to figure this out fast. And it can't just be a single country approach to this.
Yeah, Besma, I guess on the one hand, the government of Canada is obligated to its own citizens first. But on the other hand, it does want to project lest I steal a phrase from 5 or 6 years ago, it does want to project sunny ways onto the world and show that we can be a leader in other ways as well. If you had to make the call, who gets that shot first? The 20-year-old kid from Don Mills or a healthcare worker in Nigeria?
I think the logical answer, frankly, even though as I said, as a taxpayer, I want every Canadian citizen vaccinated first, is still to look at the most vulnerable internationally. And part of that is, frankly, if we're going to stamp out this virus, and I'm talking very rationally here, and seeing those new variants coming every day from the UK and South Africa, the truth of the matter is we need to stamp this out fast. These variants are very, very dangerous, and the variants are happening because it's mutating, like all viruses will. So we need to stamp this out. And the way to stamp it out is by taking care of the most vulnerable, people who are most exposed. And I think that really does mean that we have to have an international focus. The virus knows no borders. That's the truth of the matter.
Erica, last question to you. How do we go about building Canada's capacity in global health diplomacy?
Well, I think this is an area that our school's trying to take on. We argued a few months ago that Canada's capacity could be strengthened in global health diplomacy in order to ensure it's a relevant player at those global forums. And so as the School of Public Health, we've actually launched the first ever executive course. I mean, we are an education institution and we have our first cohort started. So it's the beginning of trying to build that capacity.
Wonderful. My thanks to both of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views about this. Erica Di Ruggiero, Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, Besma Momani, the University of Waterloo, and the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And Besma, we can, I guess, let the cat out of the bag. We're going to see you back on this channel tomorrow night as well, as you're going to be participating in our Democracy Agenda show with the Toronto Star tomorrow night. So look forward to seeing you then as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
Globally, you know, their past record, when you talk about democracy promotion, you can't help but George Bush and sort of what he did with Iraq to think that, you know, somehow they're in a position to spread this wonderful thing. They just don't hold the mantle anymore. And I don't think there's an appetite for it globally to hear from the United States leader that they're going to come with this great, you know, concept of democracy. It's just not the same world that we had, you know, 20 years ago.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.
It's been 50 years since Idi Amin led the military coup in Uganda that overthrew then President Milton Obote. Both occupied bloody regimes in the history of a nation whose efforts at democracy remain tentative to this day. With us now for more in Kampala, Uganda, Gerald Berebe, assistant professor of political science at York University and former reporter at the Daily Monitor, Uganda's largest independent newspaper. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, Derek Peterson, professor of African history at the University of Michigan and a winner of the Genius Fellowship from the MacArthur Foundation. He is also the author of the upcoming book, The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin, Photographs from Uganda Broadcasting Corporation. And in Wellington, in Prince Edward County, Ontario, Rita Abrahamson, professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, where she is also director of the Centre for International Policy Studies. Hello, welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here for this timely discussion. So before we start our conversation, I'm going to show a short clip that aired prior to the election. Sheldon, please roll.
We need this election in peace, as we Ugandans. We need this election to be in peace, must we?
We want peace, first of all. And we need this elections, electoral commission, to show that elections just go smooth and nice.
The Uganda election took place in January, and peace was something that we heard about the election. And here's an excerpt from The Observer shortly after President Yoweri Museveni, who has been in power for 35 years, won in a landslide. President Museveni scored 100% at 348 polling stations in the Kiruhura, Kazo, and Isingiro districts, according to analysis of presidential election data released by the Electoral Commission. Gerald, I want to start with you, being you're the furthest away and you're in Kampala on the ground. President Museveni has said that this is, and I quote, the most cheating-free election since 1962. How have the results of him winning the election been received by Ugandans?
Thank you very much for having me on now. So many Ugandans expected the elections not to be free and fair, and they were worried, of course, for their security, for their safety in the post-election period. Part of it is because the president has cultivated this image of someone who can guarantee security and peace after Uganda, of course, went through a period of socio-economic collapse and civil war that took place in 1986, and of course with the overthrow of Idi Amin and Milton Obote government. Now, since the voting took place, of course, voting was marred by widespread cases of voter fraud, ballot box stuffing. But since President Museveni was declared winner, we have witnessed mass arrest of opposition supporters. There has been high level of repression that probably never seen before in Uganda since the Idi Amin period. Part of it is because the election was highly contested. The opposition rejected the outcome. There were widespread cases of voter fraud and ballot box stuffing and falsification of results that the opposition said they could not accept the outcome of such an electoral process. So what we saw after the voting was the deployment of the military and police throughout Kampala and all other major towns in order to contain any possible cases of protest against the outcome of the election.
We should mention that the opposition, he's been called probably Museveni's most formidable opposition to date, and that's Robert Kyagulanyi, also known as Bobi Wine. And this year, it was, having an election during a pandemic, COVID protocols were used to explain a lot of the rules that are around the election. What do you think, how would you describe the current mood on the ground in Uganda?
So the challenge that the opposition had in this election was that they have no access to mass media because many of the media is controlled by the government, and when the government introduced this COVID-19 protocol and said there will not be mass rallies or campaigns, and that they have to be done through internet or online platform or radio or television, it became very difficult for the opposition to access some of these platforms because many of them, like I said, they are controlled by the government. So it became a very big challenge. But on the other hand, the government or the ruling party was able to exploit this COVID-19 and allowed the president to move all over the country to address people via radio station and television, and all his addresses were covered by every television and radio station all over the country. So the ground was, of course, tilted against the opposition in the first place.
Do you find that there is a bit of a generational divide as who supports Bobi Wine and who supports President Museveni?
Yes, so over 70% of Ugandans are below the age of 30. And Bobi Wine, being this very young, energetic, and popular musician, he has been able to become an inspiration to many youth. Like the participation of youth in this election has been very, very high. Part of it is because the way Bobi Wine carried out his campaign, really appealing to the youth, and the country being that it's one of the youngest countries in the world, the youth was able to take up this Bobi Wine's message and participated in the election. Now, the challenge that President Museveni has is that his ruling party is full of people who are all over the age of 70, and facing a candidate in Bobi Wine who is almost a half of President Museveni's age became a very big challenge. And I think going forward, that's the challenge that the ruling party faces. The country is extremely very young. The youth face a lot of problems like unemployment, lack of jobs, poor service delivery, access to education. But these are the things that the ruling party has failed to provide. And Bobi Wine has been able to highlight some of these problems that face the youth in Uganda and showing them that the ruling party for 35 years has failed to meet the challenges of the youth.
But Rita, when you look at this election, why would you say that this election is particularly significant?
Well, in light of what Gerald said, that's a good question in the sense that elections in Uganda have long been a foregone conclusion, and this election was no different. Nobody expected a free and fair election. Nobody expected Museveni and the ruling party to lose. But elections still matter. They do kind of bestow a very thin veneer of legitimacy on the regime. And I think there are several things that were important about this election. But to start, and Gerald again has hinted at this, is the phenomenal rise of Bobi Wine and the way in which Wine managed to mobilize the energy of the youth. And really it signaled that moving forward, there is no way one can rule Uganda without incorporating this massive youthful population. And that population have so far been excluded from politics, excluded from the day-to-day running of the country. And this was a really, really important change and signal to Museveni and the regime moving forward. The other thing I think it's important to highlight about this election is that it really illustrated the extent to which this regime is willing to turn to authoritarian means to keep their grip on power. I mean, violence, oppression, intimidation have been a feature of pretty much all multi-party elections in Uganda. But the violence, the intimidation this time was unprecedented. And I think this illustrates to Ugandans and to Uganda's supporters abroad that Museveni will do pretty much anything to keep his grip on power. And that calls into question a whole lot of the donor assistance that Uganda has been relying upon to a significant degree. And it shows that this is not really a democracy. We may be looking at an authoritarian regime with elections, but we're not looking at a democracy.
I think people who support Museveni would say, and this is something that President Museveni has also said, he's accused foreign agents of interfering in what's going on in Uganda. How much is that? How true is that?
I don't think there's much truth to that. I mean, this has been a tactic of Museveni for very long. This is how he seeks to delegitimize his opponents by saying they are agents or stooges of foreign governments. And if it had been up to the international community, then Idi Amin would still have been in power and so forth. There's little doubt that opposition politicians like Bobi Wine has a fair degree of support and enthusiasm in the international community, but they also have significant support and enthusiasm at home, particularly among the young urban electorate. But this is not to say, and I think this is very important to underline, it is not as if the international community, whoever they support, be it Museveni or the opposition, they cannot bring about democracy in Uganda. Democracy in Uganda can really only come from at home, from the domestic electorate. It cannot come from abroad by being imposed in any way like that.
I'd like to read a quote from Ugandan Member of Parliament Ibrahim Ssemujju Nganda that was shared on Twitter recently. He tweeted, "The difference between the Amin regime and the Museveni regime is that the Museveni regime has educated people who can explain away murders. Otherwise, the crimes that Amin committed, this regime has committed." Derek, how would you respond to people who compare Idi Amin's military dictatorship 50 years ago with Museveni's presidency today?
That kind of a claim has a lot of currency today in Uganda, as you might expect, especially on Twitter and to some extent in other media as well. And it's certainly rhetorically powerful. Comparing President Museveni to Idi Amin is useful in helping to generate outrage and to help highlight the stakes in Museveni's government. Beyond its use as a rhetorical tool, though, I'm not entirely confident that comparing President Museveni with President Amin is that helpful. For one thing, it's worth saying that while President Museveni's government is increasingly authoritarian, President Amin never held elections at all. From the late 60s, in fact, political parties were banned in Uganda. And when President Amin came to power in January 1971, he carried forward this older policy against having political parties actively engaged in public life. So the first election that was held from 1962, the first national election held from 62 forward, occurred in 1980, in December, after Idi Amin's regime fell. So one thing to say is that, the Museveni government is set up differently than the Amin government is set up. The Amin government was a military dictatorship. Politics happened by decree. Everything was done from Kampala and handed down to the provinces in a very one-way manner. President Museveni's regime works differently. I take the point that, the increasing violence in public life reminds people of aspects of the 1970s. But nonetheless, President Museveni's regime is more answerable to the public will, considerably more answerable to the public will than Amin's had been. For Amin, the military itself held the answers, and it was up to government to implement the president's directives and for administrators in the provinces to follow the line that Amin gave. That's the way that politics worked in the 70s. So
as a historian, why then does President Museveni hold elections?
Well, part of it's to do with the issues that Rita Abrahams mentioned a few minutes ago. That is the lending a kind of veneer of authenticity, as she put it, to politics. Elections have a long history in Uganda, as Rita points out. They've often been foreordained, but nonetheless, they have been, from the beginning, occasions for the creation of something like a national consensus. So the first national elections in Uganda were held in 1961. They were deeply contested. A large part of Uganda's people boycotted the elections because they didn't agree that the election itself could be legitimate, that majority rule itself was thought to be illegitimate by a significant proportion of Uganda's people. The biggest national elections in Uganda's history were held in 1962 at the time of independence. Again, deeply contested, resulted in the first prime ministership of Milton Obote, who came to power shortly after, at the time of independence. Museveni holds elections today because he's carrying on a long tradition of electoral organizing. It's a way, as colleagues who are anthropologists point out, of generating an impression, a kind of consolidating political loyalty. Even if the votes are not accurately counted entirely, nonetheless, elections have an important purpose in helping government and it's the people to whom it's accountable enter into something like a bargain with each other. That's the important thing here.
And Gerald, I want to bring you back in this. In spite of all the allegations against him, President Museveni is still seen by many as a fatherly figure. There's the nickname Sevo, and he's also been fondly called Jaja, which means grandfather. Why is this the case?
Well, the people who support Museveni, and I think we should also admit that yes, Museveni remains very popular, especially in rural areas of Uganda, where he based his rebellion to fight his way into power. So he's still very, very popular among the elderly, especially people who are maybe above 50 years. Now, they look at him as the father figure. They call him Muzei, which is a very form of respect for elderly. His wife is called Mama all over the country, among those kind of segment of the population. But part of the reason is because if you compare Museveni and Idi Amin, I would say the biggest difference is that whereas Idi Amin was a complete authoritarian or maybe dictator, Museveni is a dictator dressed in democratic clothes, right? So he has created institutions of the state, which Idi Amin did not have. But he has worked tirelessly to undermine these same institutions to ensure that no institutions gets power to become independent and hold him accountable. So this is the biggest difference between Amin's regime and Museveni's regime. The other difference is that whereas Idi Amin did many of the human rights violations in secret, many of the people that were killed or murdered under Idi Amin, we never came to know about them until later. The military in Uganda right now is willing to engage in this torture, in abduction, in kidnapping of Ugandans, and in most cases doing them during the day, and sometimes being recorded by even civilians. Many of these video clips of torture or abductions have been spreading all over internet. Part of it is because they are being recorded by individual civilians. Now, we should also admit that, yes, Museveni has created this image of himself as the father of the nation, of Uganda as a nation, Part of it is because he is such a big, dominating figure in Ugandan politics, having captured power as a rebel leader and having spent 35 years in power, creating a huge patronage network that is able to preside over to rule the country.
Well, Rita and Gerald, I'd like to read an excerpt from this piece from the Global Mail that you recently co-wrote. You write, this oppressive regime is bankrolled by international donors. The U.S. provides nearly $1 billion a year, and another $1 billion flows from other countries, including Canada and international institutions. The U.S. has trained more troops from Uganda than from any other country in sub-Saharan Africa except Burundi. Rita, what is the role that Canada and other international donors play in Uganda?
Well, Canada is really a small player in this picture. It's a relatively minor actor in Uganda. But the international community has long been involved in Uganda and has played an on and off role in terms of mobilizing and facilitating the various activities of the military. And what we've seen in recent years is that Uganda has really managed to position itself as a key ally of the United States and the international community in fighting international terrorism or fighting violent extremism in the continent. And as the international community and the United States in particular has increasingly come to perceive of Africa as a place where there could potentially be security challenges for the United States, for the rest of Africa, and for international stability, they have come to focus more and more on security. And Museveni then, as a former rebel leader with a strong and functional military, has positioned himself as a key ally, keeping in mind, of course, that the United States, Canada, and other Western countries do not themselves want to send their own soldiers for peacekeeping missions in Somalia, South Sudan, the Sahel, because these are now very dangerous missions. So peacekeeping has fallen to African countries, and Uganda has positioned itself as one of the key countries to contribute troops to these very dangerous missions. And henceforth, they have received all this assistance to train, to equip their military and their police forces. And what we saw in this election and what we see over the years is that it's this same very well-trained, very well-equipped security force that is being deployed on the streets of Kampala to police and oppress legitimate political protest.
And Gerald, you wanted to say something?
Yes, so I think the challenge for the international community is President Yoweri Museveni right now has been very, very smart in the way he has categorize the international community as outsiders trying to interfere in the internal processes of Uganda and accusing the opposition of colluding with the elements from outside, especially Europe and USA, to basically hand over the sovereignty of the country. And we have seen that many African dictators, when they are pressed by the international community, they tend to rally their country, their electorates, against external interferences. For example, we saw this in Egypt, in Zimbabwe, in Rwanda, in Libya. When these dictators are pressed by the international community, they tend to rally the support of the population against what they call as external influence in the internal processes of their country. But I think for President Yoweri Museveni, and I know the EU, for example, has proposed certain sanctions, but the international community has to be very careful in the way they come up with these sanctions so that they don't affect individual civilians on the ground. At least the sanction need to be targeted to top military and political elites who have presided over this repression against civilians in Uganda.
We only have a few minutes left, but just to go back to what you said, Rita, you said that Canada is a small player, and I think the number is 50 million compared to the US's $1 billion. Does Canada need to take more responsibility towards where and how this aid is dispersed, even if, as you said, it's small?
I think there's a lot for Canada to think about in this. I think there's a lot for it to reconsider in terms of how it positions itself vis-a-vis the broader donor agenda of supporting democracy and human rights and supporting security and stability. Now, Canada has always said that its main purpose is to support democracy and human rights. If you go to their website on Canada-Uganda relations, they say we're supporting democracy and human rights and stability and security. Well, this election shows that it's hard to do the two at the same time. And this means that Canada will have to think carefully about other ways in which it can support democracy, not from a position of superiority, not from a position of saying what a country must do, but from a position of solidarity, from a position of supporting. And I think in that sense, Canada being a small country, a middle power, doesn't have that much influence in the world. But we are at a point in the world where democracy is in decline pretty much everywhere. And most countries have withdrawn from active democracy promotion. For a country like Canada, this is potentially an opportunity to seek alliances with other middle powers to find ways of, again, supporting democratic forces at home and abroad.
Derek, before we think about moving forward, I wanted to ask you in just 1 minute if you could give us a quick description of Canada's relationship with Uganda, because it does go back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine for political scientists and policymakers to think about what things will look like going forward. But it's worth saying that Canada's connections with Uganda go back a long way. At the time of Ugandan independence in 1962, Canada provided the first training for Ugandan diplomats at the United Nations. Uganda's new UN ambassador, Apollo Chironde, sat with the Canadian High Commissioner, or the Canadian delegate rather, in New York, and was trained on how to do diplomacy with Canadians. In 1972, Pierre Trudeau welcomed 5,000 expatriated Ugandan Asians to Canada. They were expelled from Idi Amin's Uganda, and Canada was very welcoming to the expatriate community from Uganda. Many of them ended up settling in Toronto. In 1979, Canada helped to furnish the infrastructure for Uganda's first multi-party election in some 18 years. The election of December 1980 was underwritten in a large part by Canada's government. So it's worth saying that, well, I think there's much to say about what Canada ought to do going forward. What Rita said earlier about Canada as a kind of middle power, finding allies in unlikely places. For Uganda, as for Canada, there are opportunities to think outside the boxes of superpower rivalries and such to open up other ways of organizing public life. Certainly, that's what the Uganda government has wanted from the 1960s forward. Canada has been a very useful ally.
Your book, The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin, comes out soon. What can you tell us about the Amin regime that viewers might be surprised to hear?
Idi Amin was followed around by a whole gang of photographers over the course of his 9 years in power. Many of their pictures were kept in secret in a filing cabinet in the headquarters of Uganda's Ministry of Information. They came to light a few years ago. We've got them digitized, and now we've published them in this book. They're photographs from the inner life of Idi Amin's government that haven't been seen before, and they offer really rich insights into the way that Idi Amin related to his people, the way that the machinery of government worked, and into his domestic and personal life as well.
When we do think about moving forward, I think the situation in Uganda right now, from a security standpoint, the internet was shut down for a month, which meant beyond everything else, if kids were at home, they couldn't even actually study because the internet was shut off. Rita, when you think of the security of Uganda, are you concerned with how the situation is right now?
I think it's hard not to be concerned. It's hard not to be concerned about people's day-to-day lives on the streets, the bravery of many of the urban youth who've been on the streets protesting. We read almost daily about kidnappings and further disappearances. So it's hard not to be concerned. I think also, though, we often speak about youth as an obstacle and a challenge. And looking to the future of Uganda, I think the hope will have to be that there might be a way of mobilizing the energies, the creativity of this urban youth, of the youthful population. You're looking at a country with a median age of 16. That's a lot of energy. And if this election can be a spur to think about ways of more inclusive growth, then the future for Uganda could be a lot more positive than we've seen from the last few weeks and months.
Gerald, where would you like to see Uganda in 5 years?
I would like to see the country, of course, transition to democracy. It's my hope, but I don't know what might happen. The future for Uganda is quite very uncertain. In fact, right now there is a petition in the Supreme Court that is challenging the outcome of the presidential election, and the Supreme Court itself is, of course, highly stalked by judges who are sympathetic or who are to the current regime. So the hope from the Supreme Court is actually very, very low for many Ugandans. So, but at this point, the future of Uganda is very, very uncertain. We even don't know what might happen in the case, for example, President Museveni, who is now almost over 75 years old, in case he dropped dead. Right now, the most trained segment of the Ugandan army is controlled by the president's own son, who is now the commander. And there are already talks in the ruling party and inside many Ugandan politics that the president is positioning his son to take over power in case anything happened and he's unable to continue ruling the country.
And that's all the time we have. Derek, we look forward to your book, which is coming out in March. Gerald, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Kampala. And Rita, we appreciate all of your insights. Thank you so much for making some time for us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, February 17th, 2021. Democratization in many parts of the world has faced increasingly stiff headwinds over the past decade or so. Tomorrow, as part of our joint initiative with the Toronto Star, our Democracy Agenda series considers why enthusiasm for exporting liberal democratic governance isn't what it used to be. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.